So the Turks are gearing up for a full-scale invasion of Syria, and they risk coming into direct conflict with U.S. troops, which are there still for some reason. As many of you may know, a chief campaign pledge of President Donald Trump was that he was going to pull U.S. troops out of the war in Syria because the U.S. had no place there. And while the plan to withdraw troops from Syria is apparently ongoing and there are troops coming out of there, the generals convinced Trump to leave a few hundred special forces guys in Syria embedded with the YPG to assist with their operations supposedly against ISIS. But it just so happens that the YPG is the one faction that the Turks would like to invade Turkey to wipe out and neutralize. This is because the YPG is the Syrian Kurdish militia, and they, of course, operate along the Syrian-Turkish border, and just on the other side of the border in Turkey lies the PKK, which is the Turkish Kurdish group. Now, Turkey considers both of these groups to be one and the same because they are, it's transnational Kurdish nationalism. Both groups want to create a pan-Kurdish state in the Middle East. And, of course, the Turks see this as a direct threat since part of Kurdistan does lie within Turkish borders. So Turkey considers them both to be international terrorist groups, which are a threat to Turkey. Now, if you look at a map of the Middle East, it's quite obvious why the U.S. military and the U.S. defense establishment is trying desperately to hold on to their Kurdish allies in Syria, because the Kurds, along with other ethnic minorities in eastern Syria, have built up a state in between Assad's Syria and Iraq and Iran. Rojava, as they call it, or the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, which is another name I've heard thrown around, lies right in between a bunch of U.S. enemies. And as any of you who have followed U.S. mainstream opinion in the last 10 or 20 years, you may know that the threat of the Great Shia Crescent across the Middle East is something that the defense planners have been frantically afraid of. This is the idea that you could draw a crescent across the Middle East from Lebanon through Syria, through Iraq, and into Iran that is all controlled by Shiite governments. And, of course, the U.S. in the Middle East always allies with Sunnis. Whether they be Sunni Arabs or Sunni Kurds, Sunni Muslims tend to be U.S. allies. So then to have this Rojava state essentially cutting the Shia Crescent in half by putting a Sunni Muslim and Orthodox Christian-controlled state right in the middle of it is a sort of a great solution for them. And therefore, if this Kurdish government falls, well, then the Shia Crescent will be back on. Now, this, I assume, is why Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, has warned Erdogan of devastating consequences were he to invade northern Syria and try and take out the YPG. In all likelihood, if the Turks invade Syria and seriously try and take out the YPG, they will also take out a lot of American special forces who are embedded with them. And considering that Mike Pompeo promised devastating consequences, he will be able to take this evidence of dead Americans, present it to the American people and to the president, and justify increasing the U.S. presence in Syria directly against what the president's campaign pledges were, and thus we will be able to escalate the U.S.'s role in the war in Syria. And once that happens, who knows where they'll be able to take the conflict from there. I really can't speculate past that point, but what seems clear is that there is a big potential for another major U.S. Middle East war on the level of Iraq and Afghanistan, for a third front in the U.S. war in the Middle East to open up if Erdogan does in fact invade Syria. Now, another factor that it should be considered is that Turkey is technically a member of NATO, and so they are a U.S. ally. So what happens if a member of NATO goes to war with another member of NATO? Which one of them gets to invoke the NATO alliance? I assume the way that the U.S. is playing it, that it would be the U.S. who gets to invoke the NATO treaty, because Turkey technically would be the aggressor. But considering that the United States hasn't declared war on any country since the 1941, I believe, would the U.S. even go through the trouble of declaring war on Turkey, or will they just make this another overseas contingency operation without congressional approval? I mean, it'll be hard to deny that the U.S. is at war with Turkey when you have Turkish and American troops shooting at each other, but it really seems hard for me to believe that the U.S. would get NATO involved and have countries like Germany, France, and Italy helping invade Turkey from the west while the U.S. comes at them from the south. That just It seems rather far-fetched to me. Now, on the other hand, however, this may not just be Turkey that we go up against, because remember, there are more than two countries operating in Syria. You have not only Turkey and the United States, you also have the Russians. And Erdogan today apparently is in Moscow, and he plans to meet with Putin to discuss a potential Turkish invasion of the Kurdish zone in Syria. Now, obviously, what Erdogan seeks to ask Putin is that, hey, if I decide to invade and the U.S. fights back, are you going to back me up? Now, this is a pretty serious question. I would think that Putin would tell him no, because Putin, I think, has no interest in going to war with the United States in Syria. But at the same time, Russia has fought many years and is very heavily invested in Syria, so I'm sure they have no interest in seeing the U.S. stick around there as a thorn in their side. So the Russians may very well try to do something to get the U.S. out, short of getting into any direct conflict, because, of course, wars between nuclear states are never a good idea. Perhaps the Russians will be able to support the Turks and perhaps Assad both in trying to take out the Kurds and the Americans as proxies, by giving them weapons or what have you. Of course, Turkey's been in trouble with the U.S. this week over trying to buy S-400 missiles from Russia, when, of course, you know that any good American ally only buys Raytheon bombs. Well, I'll be keeping an eye on this for sure in the future, and if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing, and remember to hit the bell so that you get notified when I upload every day, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So with that said, I think I'll see you all folks tomorrow.